Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Eagle Discovery. Today, we've got an intense and controversial story making waves in the news. Venezuela has sharply criticized the United States for seizing a jet that was used by their president, Nicolás Maduro. This event has sparked major tension between the two countries, and we're going to break it down for you. Let's dive right in. Venezuela's response: an act of robbery. Venezuela's foreign minister, Iván Pinto, made strong and unequivocal remarks in his criticism of the United States after a U.S. action to seize the Venezuelan presidential jet. He referred to this act as an outright act of robbery, a statement that carried significant weight given the tense relations between the two nations. Pinto's condemnation was not limited to this single event. He suggested that such actions were symptomatic of a deeper, more troubling pattern of unlawful and aggressive behavior by the United States. This, he argued, could only be described as piracy, indicating a persistent history of interference in the affairs of sovereign nations without regard for international law or diplomacy. On September 3rd, Pinto addressed the media, emphasizing that the United States had no legal, political, or moral right to seize an aircraft that was legally owned by Venezuela. The jet in question was not just a symbol of Venezuela's political leadership, but also an essential tool for the functioning of the state. Pinto's remarks highlighted that the confiscation of the plane was not an isolated incident, but rather a direct consequence of the United States' ongoing use of unilateral, illegal sanctions against Venezuela. These sanctions, according to Pinto, were not grounded in any credible international legal framework and lacked the necessary legitimacy to justify such actions. Hey there, where are you from? I want to know which city you're watching our video from. Please leave a comment so we don't feel lonely. A small action like this will motivate us to make more videos. Thank you and much love to you. The Venezuelan government has consistently argued that the sanctions imposed by the U.S. are not just harmful to the country's economy, but also serve as a violation of Venezuela's sovereignty. Pinto strongly stressed that these sanctions are an attempt by the United States to impose its will on Venezuela, as well as on other countries that oppose U.S. policies or resist its global influence. He criticized the U.S. for acting as if it had the authority to unilaterally dictate the actions of other nations, often bypassing established international norms and diplomatic channels in favor of coercive, aggressive tactics. Furthermore, Pinto expanded on the broader geopolitical implications of the U.S. actions, calling attention to the United States' ongoing efforts to control the economic and political systems of countries that do not align with its interests. He pointed out that Venezuela, as one of the leading voices against U.S. imperialism in Latin America, had become a primary target of these types of interventions. According to Pinto, the United States had been using sanctions as a weapon, not only to punish Venezuela for its stance, but to force compliance with U.S.-led global agendas. This, Pinto argued, was a clear violation of the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states, a cornerstone of international law. Pinto also spoke about the broader impact of U.S. policies, which he said had far-reaching consequences for the people of Venezuela. He claimed that the sanctions and the ongoing political pressure were directly harming the Venezuelan population, particularly in terms of access to goods, services, and international trade. The government, Pinto argued, was being punished for its refusal to bend to U.S. demands, with everyday Venezuelans suffering the consequences of this international political struggle. In his statement, Pinto went on to say that the U.S. sanctions were a clear form of economic warfare, aimed at destabilizing Venezuela's economy and weakening its government. This, he argued, was a strategy to weaken the country from within, creating conditions for political change that would be favorable to U.S. interests. Pinto described this as a deliberate attempt to disrupt the sovereignty of the Venezuelan people, as they were being forced to endure the social and economic consequences of sanctions that were imposed without their consent or any regard for their rights as a nation. The foreign minister concluded his remarks by reiterating Venezuela's firm stance against the United States' actions, emphasizing that Venezuela would continue to fight for its sovereignty and resist foreign intervention at all costs. Pinto's remarks serve as a direct challenge to U.S. actions, reflecting the deepening political divide between the two countries and Venezuela's determination to resist external pressures that it views as unjust and illegal. All right. If you're new to this channel, Eagle Discovery warmly welcomes you. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button and remember to turn on the notification bell to catch our upcoming content. The U.S. justification: the plane was illegally purchased. So what exactly prompted the United States to seize the Venezuelan presidential jet? The controversy erupted after the U.S. Department of Justice issued a public statement outlining its justification for the action. On September 9th, U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland confirmed that the U.S. government had seized the plane, claiming it had been illegally purchased in violation of U.S. law. According to Garland's statement, the jet in question was bought for $13 million through a shell company. After the purchase, the aircraft was allegedly smuggled out of the United States and transported to Venezuela. The U.S. government's position is that this transaction violated U.S. sanctions against Venezuela, which were imposed due to the country's political and economic situation, including allegations of corruption and human rights abuses by the Venezuelan government. The aircraft, identified as a DSU Falcon 9900X, was reportedly purchased from a company based in Florida. It was then illegally exported from the U.S. to Venezuela in April 2023, with the plane being transported via the Caribbean. U.S. authorities argue that the jet was being used by Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his inner circle, a claim that is central to the United States' justification for the seizure. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, the purchase and transport of the plane were conducted in violation of the sanctions that had been imposed on the Venezuelan government by the U.S. and its allies. Anthony Salisbury, a senior official from U.S. Homeland Security Investigations, added further details, claiming that the plane was involved in illegal activities that went beyond simply violating sanctions. Salisbury suggested that the investigation was still ongoing and that authorities were working to uncover the full scope of the criminal activities associated with this aircraft. He implied that the jet could have been linked to a range of illegal financial and political dealings, possibly including money laundering, smuggling, or other forms of corruption connected to the Venezuelan government. The plane's seizure, while framed by the U.S. government as a necessary step to enforce sanctions and prevent further illegal activities, has been met with criticism from Venezuela, which argues that the confiscation was not only unlawful, but part of a broader U.S. strategy to exert political and economic pressure on the country. The Venezuelan government maintains that the plane was lawfully purchased and that the actions of the United States were a direct violation of its sovereignty. In summary, the United States justifies its decision to seize the jet by citing the alleged illegal purchase, smuggling of the plane into Venezuela, and the violation of U.S. sanctions. However, the broader implications of this act, seen by Venezuela as an infringement on its sovereignty, have escalated tensions between the two countries, with each side offering radically different perspectives on the legality and motivations behind the seizure. As investigations continue, the full scope of the alleged criminal activities involving the plane remains unclear, but the incident has certainly added another layer of complexity to the already strained relationship between the U.S. and Venezuela. Venezuela's furious reaction, a sovereignty issue. Understandably, the Venezuelan government reacted with outrage to the U.S. seizure of the presidential jet. Foreign Minister Iván Pinto was quick to condemn the action, declaring that it was not only a violation of international law, but also a direct attack on Venezuela's sovereignty. He argued that the United States had no right to seize the aircraft, and this move was part of a much broader and ongoing strategy by the U.S. to destabilize Venezuela and undermine the government led by President Nicolás Maduro. The Venezuelan government has long claimed that U.S. actions, including economic sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and covert operations, are all aimed at weakening the country and overthrowing its leadership. Pinto, in his remarks, stressed that the seizure of the plane was emblematic of a pattern of interference in Venezuela's internal affairs, designed to create chaos and push the country into political turmoil. According to Pinto, the United States was once again trying to assert its dominance in the region, using illegal and coercive tactics to impose its will on a sovereign nation. President Nicolás Maduro, echoing the sentiments of his foreign minister, has also vehemently denounced the U.S. actions. Maduro used the seizure of the jet as a rallying cry to unite Venezuelans in opposition to what he called U.S. imperialism and interference. He framed the incident as part of a long-standing history of U.S. aggression toward Venezuela, dating back to the early years of his presidency and even earlier, during the presidency of Hugo Chavez. Maduro emphasized that the U.S. had consistently tried to undermine Venezuela's independence and sovereignty, from supporting opposition forces to imposing crippling sanctions on the country's economy. In response to the seizure, Maduro vowed that Venezuela would not be intimidated by such acts of aggression. He urged the Venezuelan people to stand firm in their resolve to resist U.S. interference, insisting that Venezuela would continue to defend its right to self-determination and its sovereignty on the world stage. Maduro made it clear that, despite facing immense pressure from the U.S. and its allies, Venezuela would not bend to foreign demands and would continue to pursue its own path, free from external coercion. This incident has become a symbol of the broader geopolitical struggle between Venezuela and the United States. For Maduro and his supporters, the seizure of the plane is yet another example of the U.S. trying to impose its will on a country that refuses to align with its interests. In this context, the Venezuelan government has framed the issue not just as a legal or political dispute over the jet, but as a fundamental battle over sovereignty and the right to chart its own course without interference from foreign powers. Pinto and Maduro both stressed that Venezuela would continue to challenge the U.S. actions in international forums, seeking support from other nations that also oppose the kind of unilateralism that the U.S. is accused of. In particular, they have looked to countries in Latin America, as well as allies like Russia and China, for diplomatic backing in their efforts to resist U.S. pressure. Maduro's rhetoric has been particularly pointed, urging a united front against the U.S. and its attempts to interfere in the internal affairs of sovereign nations. Overall, the seizure of the plane has become a flashpoint in the ongoing tensions between Venezuela and the U.S. The Venezuelan government views this incident as part of a larger pattern of aggressive actions by the U.S., designed to weaken Venezuela both politically and economically. While the U.S. justifies its actions as part of enforcing sanctions and preventing illegal activities, for Venezuela, this is seen as yet another affront to its sovereignty and an example of ongoing U.S. interference in the country's internal affairs. The U.S. perspective, upholding sanctions and international law. From the United States standpoint, the decision to seize the Venezuelan presidential jet is framed as part of a broader and crucial effort to uphold international law, particularly with regard to the sanctions imposed on Venezuela. The U.S. government maintains that its actions are justified under both U.S. domestic law and the broader framework of international sanctions, which were imposed on Venezuela due to the government's alleged involvement in corruption, human rights violations, and its support for anti-U.S. regimes globally. According to U.S. officials, the plane in question was part of a larger scheme that involved the smuggling of goods and the violation of U.S. sanctions. The U.S. Department of Justice contends that the jet, purchased illegally through a shell company, was used to facilitate illicit activities, including the potential transportation of illegal goods between the United States and Venezuela. These activities, the U.S. argues, are in direct contravention of the sanctions imposed on the Venezuelan government by the U.S. and its allies, which are designed to pressure President Nicolás Maduro's regime over its domestic and foreign policies. The U.S. government claims that by seizing the plane, it is enforcing its national laws and ensuring that individuals and entities linked to the Venezuelan government are held accountable for their role in these illicit operations. U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland's statement highlighted that the U.S. is committed to using its legal system to prevent the violation of its sanctions, which it views as critical to maintaining its foreign policy goals. Garland also emphasized that the seizure was part of a broader effort to prevent Venezuela's government from bypassing international sanctions and using illicit means to circumvent financial restrictions. Furthermore, the U.S. government links the seizure of the jet to a larger web of criminal activities, though many details remain under investigation. According to U.S. law enforcement officials, the plane may have been involved in illegal financial transactions, money laundering, and smuggling operations, possibly facilitating the flow of resources that directly benefit the Venezuelan government's leadership. The plane's role in this network, U.S. officials assert, goes beyond just the violation of sanctions, potentially implicating the Venezuelan government in a range of illicit practices designed to prop up its regime and undermine international efforts to hold it accountable. In addition to the seizure, U.S. authorities are continuing to investigate the full extent of the criminal activities linked to the aircraft. According to Anthony Salisbury, a senior official with U.S. Homeland Security investigations, the jet's involvement in these activities is part of a broader pattern of conduct that the U.S. is determined to uncover and address. Salisbury indicated that authorities are following multiple leads to track down all individuals and entities associated with the illegal operations, and that further actions could be taken as more information becomes available. For the United States, the seizure of the jet is not only about enforcing sanctions, but also about sending a message to other countries and individuals who might attempt to evade U.S. laws. The U.S. sees this as an essential step in holding those who enable or support the Venezuelan government's activities accountable, and in ensuring that sanctions are respected on the global stage. Officials argue that such actions are a necessary part of maintaining the integrity of international financial systems and preventing governments like Venezuela's from continuing to engage in what they consider unlawful activities without facing consequences. Thus, the U.S. perspective on the seizure is firmly rooted in the belief that upholding sanctions and international law is essential for maintaining global order and accountability. The United States views this action as part of a larger effort to curb the influence of regimes that it considers to be destabilizing, and to ensure that countries like Venezuela adhere to international norms of behavior. Despite the ongoing diplomatic tensions, the U.S. maintains that its legal and political stance is consistent with the enforcement of international sanctions and the broader protection of global stability. What's next? A diplomatic standoff. The incident involving the seizure of the Venezuelan presidential jet is the latest in a long-running saga of diplomatic tension between Venezuela and the United States. For years, the two countries have been at odds, with the U.S. imposing heavy sanctions on Venezuela in response to the country's political, economic, and human rights issues. The Venezuelan government has consistently argued that these sanctions are not just punitive measures, but part of a broader U.S. strategy to undermine the country's sovereignty and control its political and economic systems. The controversy surrounding the seizure of the jet has only intensified the already strained relationship. The Venezuelan government has vehemently demanded the return of the aircraft, calling the seizure illegal, unjust, and an infringement on its sovereignty. Venezuelan officials, led by Foreign Minister Iván Pinto and President Nicolás Maduro, have framed the incident as part of a larger pattern of U.S. interference in Venezuela's internal affairs. In their view, the United States is using every possible tool — sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and now the confiscation of a national asset — to destabilize Venezuela and weaken its government. On the other side, the U.S. government stands firm in its decision to seize the plane, arguing that it was a necessary action to uphold both U.S. laws and international sanctions against the Venezuelan regime. The U.S. maintains that the plane's purchase and its transportation to Venezuela violated U.S. sanctions, and that this was a critical move to hold accountable those involved in illegal activities. The U.S. has made it clear that it will continue to enforce its sanctions and take further actions if needed, including targeting individuals and entities connected to the Venezuelan government who may be involved in similar illicit operations. As both sides dig in their heels, the question remains: what happens next? Will this situation escalate into further tensions? Or will there be an opportunity for dialogue and diplomatic resolution? The international community is closely watching the developments, with some countries already weighing in on the side of one government or the other, adding another layer of complexity to the dispute. The possibility of further escalation cannot be ruled out. The U.S. has historically taken a hardline stance against the Venezuelan government, and this incident only adds fuel to that fire. However, the diplomatic channels between the two countries have not been entirely closed. There have been occasional talks and negotiations in the past, even as tensions remained high, and both governments are likely aware of the potential consequences of a complete breakdown in relations. On the other hand, it is also possible that the situation could lead to some form of diplomatic resolution, especially if both countries are willing to engage in constructive dialogue. However, given the deep mistrust and the political stakes involved, this is no easy task. Venezuela will likely continue to push for the return of the jet and for the U.S. to lift sanctions, while the U.S. will likely insist on strict enforcement of its policies and demand greater accountability from the Venezuelan government. One thing is certain: this is far from over. The seizure of the plane has become yet another flashpoint in the ongoing diplomatic standoff between Venezuela and the U.S., a standoff that seems poised to continue for the foreseeable future. Whether the two nations will find a way to resolve the situation peacefully, or whether it will escalate into even greater conflict, remains to be seen. Time will tell, but what is clear is that the issue of Venezuela's sovereignty, U.S. sanctions, and the broader political struggle between the two nations will continue to shape the diplomatic landscape for years to come. That's it for today's update on this dramatic international issue. What do you think about the situation between Venezuela and the U.S.? Is the U.S. justified in its actions? Or is this another case of overreach? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to give us a like, share with your friends, and subscribe to stay updated with the latest news and in-depth analyses from around the world. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.